Hello. Tonight we step back into a time when the world felt both vast and fragile, when distant cities carried names that still echo in our quietest thoughts. Imagine the dust settling slowly over the hills around Jerusalem as the sun dips behind the horizon, the call to prayer drifting across stone walls, answered faintly by church bells from within the same city. For centuries these sounds had coexisted, not always in peace, but in a tense, lived-in rhythm. Nothing about what was coming felt sudden. The roots ran deep, tangled, and old. By the late 11th century, the Near East had already changed hands many times, but the most recent shift still stung. In 1071, at a place called Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, the Byzantine army met the Seljuk Turks in battle. The Seljuks, nomadic warriors who had swept out of Central Asia only decades earlier, shattered the imperial forces. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was captured. Large parts of Asia Minor, the empire's heartland, slipped from Byzantine control almost overnight. The roads that pilgrims had once travelled in relative safety became uncertain. Small bands of Turks roamed deeper into what had been Greek-speaking lands. Villages that had paid taxes to Constantinople now answered to new lords speaking a different tongue. For Christian pilgrims from the west, the journey to Jerusalem grew steadily more dangerous, though it never entirely stopped. They still came merchants, monks, knights seeking penance, ordinary men and women hoping to kneel at the places named in the Gospels. Some returned with stories of harassment, tolls demanded at every bridge and mountain pass, occasional beatings, thefts, even killings. Others spoke of fair treatment under local emirs who cared more for revenue than religion. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Yet the harsher tales travelled faster and lodged deeper in the memory. Letters reached monasteries and courts, describing pilgrims forced to pay exorbitant fees simply to approach the Holy Sepulchre, or beaten for crossing themselves too openly. Exaggeration played its part, but the kernel of fear was real. Across the Bosporus, in Constantinople, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sat on a throne that felt less secure with every passing season. He had come to power in 1081 after a coup, inheriting an empire bled dry by civil wars and the Manzikert disaster. The treasury was nearly empty, the army reduced to mercenaries, the Anatolian estates that once fed the capital now held by Turks. Alexios was shrewd, patient, and ruthless when he needed to be. He understood that he could not recover the lost provinces by himself. The empire needed allies, and the only place strong enough to provide meaningful help lay far to the west, among the fractious kingdoms of Latin Christendom. He began sending envoys to Rome and beyond, asking not for conquest, but for soldiers, mercenaries, knights, anyone willing to fight the Turks in exchange for pay or land. What Alexios wanted was a limited military aid package. What he would eventually receive was something far larger and far less controllable. In Rome, Pope Urban II listened carefully to these requests. Urban had been pope since 1088, a man of strong will who had spent much of his pontificate wrestling with the investiture controversy, the long, bitter struggle with the German emperor over who had the right to appoint bishops. By the 1090s, that fight had eased into an uneasy truce, and Urban's attention turned outward. He saw an opportunity. The Church could unite the quarrelling princes of the West under a single banner. It could channel the restless energy of a continent where too many younger sons had no land, too many feuds ended only in exhaustion, and too many people lived one bad harvest away from starvation. A holy war, properly directed, might cleanse sins, win glory, and not incidentally strengthen the authority of the papacy itself. Western Europe in those years was crowded and restless. Population had grown steadily since the worst of the Viking and Magyar raids had faded. Yet the amount of good farmland had not. Younger sons of noble families trained for war but inherited little. Knights without land turned to private warfare, burning villages over boundary disputes or simply to keep their retainers fed. In the countryside, famine struck with cruel regularity. In the towns, merchants and artisans looked for new markets. Everyone, in one way or another, felt the pressure of too many people and too few opportunities. Penance was popular: long pilgrimages, generous donations, anything that promised forgiveness for the violence that seemed woven into daily life. The idea of a pilgrimage that was also a righteous war began to feel less strange and more inevitable. None of this happened in a single moment. No trumpet sounded, no sudden revelation descended. Instead, small decisions accumulated. A Byzantine emperor who swallowed his pride and asked for help. A pope who saw a chance to heal schisms and expand influence. Knights and peasants who heard rumors of a land flowing with spiritual reward and earthly possibility. Merchants who calculated the profits of safer trade routes. The seeds of what would be called a crusade had been quietly germinating for years. And so, in the autumn of 1095, when Urban II climbed onto a platform outside the town of Clermont in central France, the ground was already prepared. The air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke from the hearths below the hill, and the crowd knights, clergy, common folk, stood close together against the chill. What he would say there would give those scattered longings a name and a direction, but that moment still lay just ahead, waiting in the gathering dusk. For now the world simply waited, divided yet bound together by threads of ambition, faith, and fear, each side watching the other across a narrowing distance. The storm had not yet broken, but everyone could feel the air grow heavier. The words Urban II spoke that November day in 1095 did not fall into silence. They landed on soil already cracked open by need and longing, and the crowd answered almost before he finished. Picture the scene late in the afternoon, the open field outside Clermont's cathedral walls, a cold wind moving through bare trees, the smell of damp wool and wood smoke hanging over thousands of people packed shoulder to shoulder, knights in mail, peasants in patched tunics, monks, women holding children, old men leaning on sticks. They had come from villages and towns across central France, drawn by rumors that the Pope himself would address them. Urban stood on a raised platform, probably built of rough planks for the occasion. He spoke in Latin, but bishops and priests translated his words into the local Languedoc so everyone could understand. His sermon was not long by medieval standards, but it was carefully shaped. He reminded them of the suffering of Eastern Christians under Turkish rule, of churches turned into stables, of pilgrims robbed and murdered. He described the Holy Sepulchre, the place of Christ's burial and resurrection, held in Muslim hands. Then he shifted to something new. This was not merely a call to defend the distant East, he said. This was a chance for the West itself to be cleansed. Knights who lived by the sword could now turn that sword to a holy purpose. Sins would be forgiven. Penalties for crimes would be suspended. Anyone who took the cross, the simple cloth emblem sewn onto clothing, would receive a plenary indulgence. Full remission of all temporal punishment due to sin. If they died on the journey or in battle, they would go straight to heaven. The crowd roared. Men tore cloth from their cloaks and stitched crosses on the spot. Some cut crosses into their own flesh with knives. The cry that rose again and again was, Deus Vult, God wills it. Urban had not planned the phrase. It came from the people, and he let it stand. By the time he stepped down, the idea had a life of its own. News of Clermont spread with startling speed for the year 1095. Messengers carried the Pope's words to other cities. Preachers, authorized and unauthorized, repeated the message in marketplaces, at crossroads, in village churches. Within weeks, the response was no longer limited to knights and nobles. Ordinary people began to move. They sold what little they owned, gathered families, joined neighbors, and started walking. They had no clear plan, no supply lines, no commanders. They simply believed that God would provide. Two figures emerged as the most visible leaders of this first wave: Walter Saint-Savoie, Walter the Penniless, and Peter the Hermit. Walter, a minor noble from northern France or the Low Countries, gathered a large following of mostly poor men, some women, and children. They set out in spring 1096, heading east through the Rhineland toward Constantinople. Peter, a barefoot preacher with a reputation for holiness, attracted an even larger and more mixed crowd. He carried a letter supposedly from the Pope, though historians doubt Urban ever wrote it. Peter's followers were convinced that divine favor rested on them specifically. Both groups moved in loose columns, living off the land, begging, sometimes stealing. In the Rhineland towns, Mainz, Worms, Speyer, Cologne, the pilgrims met local Jewish communities. For many of the marchers, Jews were the nearest visible infidels. Rumors had already spread that Jews had poisoned wells or aided the Turks. Some preachers openly encouraged attacks. In May and June 1096, crowds turned on Jewish quarters. Houses were broken into, synagogues burned, families killed or forced to convert. In Mainz alone, hundreds died. Bishops tried to protect the Jews, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The violence was neither universal nor centrally ordered, but it was widespread enough to leave a bitter memory. The armies, if they can be called, that reached Constantinople in summer and early autumn 1096. Alexios Komnenos had asked for disciplined troops, not this. The Crusaders were hungry, unruly, and in many cases armed only with farm tools or makeshift spears. They camped outside the city walls, raided nearby villages, and quarreled among themselves. Alexios, wary of their numbers, arranged for them to be ferried across the Bosporus into Asia Minor as quickly as possible. Once on the eastern side, the lack of organization became fatal. Walter's group moved inland first. Near Nicaea, they met a Seljuk force under Kilij Arslan. The Crusaders were caught in open country, poorly armed, and without any real command structure. Most were killed or scattered within hours. A few survivors limped back to Constantinople. Peter's larger contingent arrived soon after. They found the region stripped bare by Walter's men and by the Seljuks. Food grew scarce. Discipline collapsed entirely. In October 1096, near Sivatolt on the coast, they were ambushed. The Seljuks cut them down methodically. Thousands died. The rest were enslaved or fled to the ships that had brought them. Peter himself had returned to Constantinople earlier to ask for aid, and so survived, but the People's Crusade ended in complete destruction. The lesson was harsh and immediate. Faith alone, no matter how sincere, could not overcome distance, hunger, disease, and a well-organized enemy. The untrained, the leaderless, the overconfident, they paid the highest price. Yet the failure did not stop the larger movement. It merely showed that something more structured would be needed. Behind the horizon, the great nobles were already gathering men, money, and weapons. They had heard the same call, but they intended to answer it differently. The first flame had burned bright and brief, leaving ash and silence in its wake. Somewhere in the distance, another, slower fire was being carefully laid. That slower fire took shape in the halls of castles across France, Germany, and Italy, where the great lords heard Urban's call and began to prepare, not with haste, but with the deliberate weight of ambition and duty. The First Crusade, as it would come to be known, was led not by kings, but by princes and dukes, men who commanded respect through bloodlines and battle scars. Godfrey of Bouillon, a duke from Lower Lorraine, sold much of his land to fund the journey, bringing a disciplined force of knights from the Low Countries and Germany. He was tall, fair-haired, known for his piety and fairness, the kind of leader who inspired loyalty without demanding it. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman from southern Italy, was different, cunning, ambitious, with a reputation for intrigue earned from wars against the Byzantines. He saw the East as a place to carve out his own principality. Raymond IV of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest lords in France, led the largest contingent, drawn from Provence in the south. He was older, devout, but stubborn, often clashing with others over command. Robert of Normandy, son of William the Conqueror, mortgaged his duchy to his brother to join, bringing English and Norman troops known for their ferocity. These were not unified under one banner. Each leader had his own army, his own goals. They set out in late summer and autumn of 1096, converging on Constantinople by different routes, some overland through Hungary, others by sea. The journey itself tested them before any enemy appeared. Imagine trudging through the Balkans in winter, the ground frozen underfoot, carts breaking on rocky paths, the air sharp with pine and frost. Supplies ran low in hostile territories. Men fell to cold or skirmishes with local bandits. When they reached Constantinople in spring 1097, Alexios I welcomed them warily. He required oaths of fealty that any reconquered lands would return to Byzantine control. Most swore, though grudgingly. Bohemond did so with a smile that hid his intentions. The emperor ferried them across the strait, providing guides and markets, but he kept his distance, remembering the chaos of the People's Crusade. Asia Minor lay ahead, a landscape of rolling hills turning green with spring rains, but held by Seljuk Turks under Kilij Arslan. The Crusaders besieged Nicaea in May 1097, its walls rising sheer from the lakeside, the scent of blooming orchards mixing uneasily with smoke from siege fires. After weeks, the city surrendered not to the Franks but to Byzantine forces who had arrived by boat. The Crusaders moved on, grumbling but intact. In July, at Dorylaeum, they faced a Turkish ambush, arrows whistling through dry grass, horses stumbling in the heat. The knights held formation, charging in waves until the Turks broke. It was their first major victory, but the cost in men and mounts was steep. Deeper into Anatolia, the path grew harsher. Summer sun baked the earth. Water sources dried up. Men drank from streams tainted by upstream camps, leading to waves of dysentery that left bodies by the roadside. Families who had joined wives, children, servants suffered most, their cries fading into the endless march. Betrayal simmered too. Local Armenian Christians offered aid, but some guides led them astray for personal gain. By autumn 1097, they reached Antioch, a massive city on the Orontes River, its walls snaking up hillsides like a stone serpent, towers casting long shadows in the late light. The siege began in October, dragging through winter. Rain turned the ground to mud. Food stores dwindled. You can almost feel the chill seeping through woolen cloaks as men huddled around sparse fires, the smell of unwashed bodies and rotting provisions heavy in the air. Starvation set in by Christmas nights boiled leather saddles for soup. Some resorted to cannibalism in whispers. Desertions increased. Even Peter the Hermit tried to flee before being caught and shamed. Betrayals deepened the misery. Bohemond secretly negotiated with a tower guard named Firuz, an Armenian convert to Islam, unhappy with his Turkish overlords. In June 1098, under cover of night, Firuz lowered ladders. The Crusaders stormed in. What followed was chaos. Streets slick with blood, houses looted, civilians caught in the frenzy. Thousands died in the initial assault, Muslim and Christian alike, as the attackers could not always distinguish in the dark. The main citadel held out, but the city was theirs. Days later, a larger Turkish army under Kerboga arrived to relieve Antioch, trapping the Crusaders inside. Now they were the besieged, weakened by months of hardship. Hunger returned. Disease spread through crowded quarters. In this desperation, a Provençal peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed a vision. The Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side, lay buried in the Cathedral of St. Peter. They dug and found an iron spearhead. Skeptics, including Raymond's chaplain, doubted it was authentic, but the find lifted spirits like a cool breeze through fevered halls. Godfrey and others saw it as a sign. Bohemond used it to rally the men. On the 28th of June 1098, they sallied out in a desperate charge. The Turks, overconfident, fragmented. The Crusaders won, scattering the relief force. Antioch was secure, but at what price? The siege had cost, perhaps half their number dead from battle, starvation, illness. Bohemond claimed the city for himself, breaking his oath to Alexios and sowing discord with Raymond, who wanted it for the Byzantines. They lingered in Antioch through summer, recovering but quarrelling. Plague struck in August, claiming Adhemar of Lepoy, the papal legate, and a voice of unity. By November, they marched south toward Jerusalem, a reduced force of perhaps 13,000, picking up smaller victories along the way, but haunted by the ghosts of those left behind. Jerusalem appeared in June 1099, its golden dome of the rock glinting under a relentless sun, walls baked white by centuries. The Fatimid garrison had prepared, wells poisoned, trees felled to deny cover. The Crusaders camped on the hills, the air thick with dust, and the distant call of muezzins. Siege towers were built from scavenged wood. Assaults began in July. On the 15th, Godfrey's tower breached the northern wall. Men poured in. The aftermath was grim. In the streets and temples, a massacre unfolded. Muslims, Jews, even some Eastern Christians, killed in the heat of victory. The Temple Mount ran with blood. Synagogues were set alight with people inside. Chroniclers later exaggerated numbers, but the scale was vast. Perhaps 3,000 to 10,000 dead in a city of 20,000. The Crusaders justified it as divine retribution, but the silence that followed spoke of something darker. Godfrey was elected ruler, but took the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, dying a year later. His brother Baldwin became the first king of Jerusalem. Other states formed: Baldwin's county of Edessa in the north, Bohemond's Principality of Antioch, Raymond's county of Tripoli along the coast. These were fragile outposts, linked by roads vulnerable to raid, sustained by Italian merchants and fresh arrivals from Europe. The success was improbable. A few thousand men had crossed continents to seize a distant prize. Yet it rested on foundations of betrayal, starvation, and unchecked violence. Just like us, they chased redemption through action, only to find it shadowed by regret. The holy city stood quiet now under new banners, but the winds carried whispers of resentment that would not stay buried. In the years that followed, those whispers grew into something more tangible, as life in these new lands balanced on the edge of survival. Those new banners fluttering over Jerusalem and the coastal cities did not bring lasting peace. Instead, they marked the beginning of something far more uncertain, a string of small states collectively called Outremer, the land beyond the sea. 4 main territories took shape in the early 12th century. The Kingdom of Jerusalem held the heartland, stretching from Beirut in the north to the desert south of Gaza. North of it lay the county of Tripoli, a narrow coastal strip claimed by Raymond of Toulouse's heirs. Further up the coast stood the Principality of Antioch, Bohemond's prize, reaching inland toward Aleppo. Furthest east was the county of Edessa, Baldwin's northern outpost on the upper Euphrates, more Armenian than Frankish in character. Together they formed a fragile chain along the eastern Mediterranean, never more than a few days' march wide at any point, surrounded on 3 sides by enemies, and dependent on the 4th, the sea, for survival. Life in Outremer was lived under perpetual watch. Raids came almost monthly, Bedouin horsemen sweeping down from the hills, Turkish light cavalry probing for weakness, Fatimid armies from Egypt launching periodic invasions. No harvest was guaranteed, no road was truly safe. Farmers worked fields within sight of watchtowers, ready to drop tools and run for the nearest castle at the first dust cloud on the horizon. Merchants travelled in armed convoys, paying heavy tolls to local lords for passage. The population remained small, perhaps 100,000 to 150,000 Franks at its peak, scattered across cities and fortresses, vastly outnumbered by the native Muslims, Eastern Christians, Jews, and Druze, who continued their daily lives much as before. The Franks never became a majority. They ruled as a thin military elite, living mostly in fortified towns and castles, rather than spreading out across the countryside. Over time, some adaptation occurred. Younger generations born in the Levant spoke Arabic alongside French, wore lighter Eastern clothing to cope with the heat, and adopted local food states, olives, spiced dishes that would have seemed foreign back in Normandy or Provence. Intermarriage happened, though rarely at the highest levels. Many knights took local Christian or converted wives. Yet deep tensions persisted. The Frankish nobility viewed themselves as conquerors, entitled to special privileges. Taxes fell heaviest on the non-Franks. Justice often favored the newcomers. Native Christians, especially the Orthodox and Jacobites, resented the Latin clergy imposed on them, who claimed superiority and sometimes seized churches. Muslims lived under dhimmi status, protected but second class, paying the jizya tax in exchange for exemption from military service. The arrangement held because the Franks needed the taxes and the labor, but trust remained thin. The most visible symbols of Frankish power and vulnerability were the castles. They rose on hilltops and promontories, massive stone structures designed to withstand long sieges. Crac des Chevaliers, perhaps the finest, stood on a ridge overlooking the Homs Gap. Its concentric walls thick enough to shrug off catapult stones, its inner keep rising like a ship's prow above the surrounding plain. Water cisterns cut deep into bedrock held months of supply. Granaries and stables allowed garrisons to endure years if needed. Yet even these fortresses were not invincible. They required constant maintenance, large garrisons, and steady supplies from the coast. A single bad harvest or blocked road could turn a stronghold into a trap. Two military orders became the backbone of defense: the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar. The Hospitallers began as a charitable brotherhood caring for pilgrims in Jerusalem before the conquest. After 1099, they took up arms, wearing black mantles with a white cross. The Templars formed around 1119, originally to protect pilgrims on the roads, adopting white mantles with a red cross. Both took monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but directed them toward warfare. They answered only to the Pope, not to local kings, which gave them independence, but also created friction. Their castles Margat for the Hospitallers, Safita and Tortosa for the Templars dotted the frontier. Their knights were professional, disciplined, and fanatically committed, willing to hold positions long after secular lords would have withdrawn. Without them, Outremer would have collapsed decades earlier. Relations with the outside world were never simple. Byzantium remained a difficult neighbor. The emperors in Constantinople viewed the Crusader states as usurpers who had failed to return promised territories. Occasional alliances formed joint campaigns against common Turkish foes, but mutual suspicion ran deep. The Byzantines sometimes blockaded ports or withheld aid when it suited them. To the south and east, Muslim powers watched and waited. The Fatimids in Egypt sent expeditions, but lacked the unity for sustained conquest. In Syria, Atabegs and emirs quarrelled among themselves, giving the Franks breathing room. Yet that fragmentation was slowly ending. The first serious warning came in 1144. Edessa, the easternmost county, had always been the weakest link, isolated, heavily Armenian, ruled by a series of mediocre counts. In December of that year, Imad al-Din Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, besieged the city. The garrison fought hard, but lacked reinforcements. On Christmas Eve, Zengi's troops breached the walls. The massacre that followed spared few Franks. The native Christians were treated more leniently. Edessa fell, the first major Crusader possession lost since the conquest. The news reached Jerusalem like a cold wind through open gates. King Fulk had died the year before. His young son Baldwin III ruled under his mother Melisende's regency. The loss of Edessa was more than territorial, it was psychological. For the first time, the idea that Outremer could endure indefinitely began to crack. Messengers rode west with urgent pleas for help. In Europe, the response would come, but it would be slower and less unified than before. For now, the remaining states held, their walls still standing, their garrisons still vigilant. Yet in the quiet hours, when the wind moved through the arrow slits of Crac des Chevaliers, or along the battlements of Antioch, one could almost hear the distant sound of something shifting, not yet an avalanche, but the first small stones beginning to roll. The fall of Edessa in 1144 sent shockwaves westward that took 2 years to reach full strength. In Jerusalem, the regent Melisende and young Baldwin III appealed urgently for aid, and in Europe, the response gathered around one of the most influential voices of the age, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was abbot of the Cistercian monastery at Clairvaux, a small, austere man whose sermons could move entire regions. He was no warrior. He had never held a sword. Yet his words carried the weight of divine authority for thousands. At the request of Pope Eugenius III, Bernard preached the Second Crusade across France and Germany in 1146 and early 1147. His message was direct. The loss of Edessa was a sign of God's displeasure with Christian sin. Only a new expedition, led by kings themselves, could restore honor and secure salvation. He promised the same plenary indulgence Urban had offered, absolving participants of all sins. The response was strong, especially among the nobility, who still remembered the glory of the First Crusade. Two monarchs answered the call most prominently. Louis VII of France, young, pious, and recently married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, took the cross at Vézelay in March 1147. His decision was partly spiritual, partly political, a way to unify his restless barons and perhaps strengthen his shaky marriage. In Germany, Conrad III, the Hohenstaufen king, who had long feuded with the Welfs, joined after Bernard preached before him in Frankfurt. Conrad's army was larger but less cohesive, drawn from across the fragmented Holy Roman Empire. The two kings set out separately in the summer of 1147. Conrad marched overland through Hungary and the Balkans, following the route of the First Crusade. His force suffered heavily from supply shortages and skirmishes with Byzantine troops, who viewed the Germans with suspicion. By the time they crossed into Asia Minor, disease and desertion had thinned their ranks. In October, near Dorylaeum, Turkish forces under the Sultan of Iconium ambushed them in open terrain. The Germans were routed. Conrad himself was wounded and barely escaped with a remnant of his army to Nicaea. The survivors limped on to Antioch, but the German contingent was effectively finished as a fighting force. Louis VII's French army followed a few months later, taking a similar overland path. They too faced harassment from Byzantine patrols and Turkish raiders. In Anatolia they avoided the worst of the earlier disaster by hugging the coast, but progress was slow. By spring 1148 they reached Antioch, where Louis lingered for weeks. Relations with Prince Raymond of Antioch, Eleanor's uncle, grew tense. Rumors of an improper closeness between Eleanor and Raymond circulated and damaged morale. Louis refused Raymond's plan to march north against Aleppo, and instead pressed south toward Jerusalem. By summer 1148 the surviving Crusaders, mostly French, with some German remnants and local Outremer troops assembled at Acre. The decision was made to attack Damascus, the largest and wealthiest city in inland Syria. At the time, Damascus was ruled by the Burid dynasty, nominally independent but under pressure from Zengi's successor, Nur ad-Din, who controlled Aleppo and Mosul. Crucially, Damascus had maintained a wary but functional truce with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The city's orchards and gardens provided food. Its walls were strong. Attacking it made little strategic sense. It would alienate a potential ally and push Damascus into Nur ad-Din's arms. The siege began in July 1148. The Crusaders camped in the lush Ghouta orchards east of the city, where shade and water were plentiful at first. But the orchards also concealed ambushes. Damascene troops harassed supply lines and cut down fruit trees to deny cover. Within days, the Crusaders shifted their camp to the open plain south of the walls, losing the advantage of shade in the midsummer heat. The city's defenders sallied out repeatedly, while Nur ad-Din's forces began to approach from the north. After only 4 days, the leaders Louis, Conrad, and Baldwin III abandoned the siege and withdrew. No assault had seriously threatened the walls. The retreat was orderly but humiliating. Stragglers were picked off by pursuing horsemen. The Second Crusade ended in complete failure. No territory was gained. No Muslim power was weakened. Instead, the expedition had exhausted resources, cost thousands of lives, and damaged the reputation of the entire crusading enterprise. In Europe, chroniclers and preachers struggled to explain the defeat. Some blamed the sins of the participants. Others pointed to poor leadership or Byzantine treachery. Bernard himself faced criticism his promises of victory had not held. The Crusades' collapse undermined confidence in the idea that God would reward large-scale holy wars with automatic success. While the Crusaders faltered, the Muslim response grew steadily more unified. Imad ad-Din Zengi, the man who had taken Edessa, had already begun framing the struggle as a defensive jihad against Frankish intrusion. His assassination in 1146 by a disgruntled servant did not halt the process, it accelerated it. His son, Nur ad-Din Mahmud, inherited Aleppo and Mosul and proved far more capable. Tall, austere, devout, Nur ad-Din presented himself as the champion of Sunni Islam against both Shia Fatimids and Christian invaders. He built mosques and madrasas, patronized scholars, and enforced stricter religious observance in his territories. His armies were disciplined, his governors loyal. He avoided reckless assaults on the Crusader states, but steadily eroded their position through raids, diplomacy, and opportunism. After the failed Damascus siege, Nur ad-Din moved quickly. The Burid ruler of Damascus, unnerved by the Frankish attack, sought his protection. In 1154, Nur ad-Din took the city without serious resistance, uniting Aleppo and Damascus under one rule for the first time in decades. The Muslim front now stretched continuously from the Euphrates to the borders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Among Nur ad-Din's growing circle of officers was a young Kurdish commander from Tikrit named Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the Franks as Saladin. He had entered service under his uncle Shirkuh, one of Nur ad-Din's most trusted generals. In the early 1150s, Saladin was still a junior figure, capable, educated, but untested in high command. His moment would come later, for now he watched, learned, and rose quietly in the ranks of a movement that was beginning to see the Franks not as temporary invaders, but as a problem that could be solved. The contrast was stark. One side returned home dispirited, questioning the worth of distant wars. The other side consolidated power, built institutions, and prepared for the long contest ahead. The balance in the Levant had shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, but decisively. And in that shifting balance, the stage was quietly being set for a confrontation far greater than any that had come before. The quiet consolidation that followed the Second Crusade did not last. By the 1170s, the Muslim world had found its unifying figure in Salah ad-Din Yusuf Saladin to the Franks. Born in Tikrit to a Kurdish family, he had risen through Nur ad-Din's service, first as a junior officer, then as commander of his uncle Shirkuh's campaigns in Egypt. When Shirkuh died in 1169, Saladin took control of the Fatimid Vizierate in Cairo. 4 years later, he abolished the Shia Fatimid Caliphate altogether, restoring Sunni rule under the nominal authority of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. Nur ad-Din died in 1174, and Saladin moved swiftly to claim his Syrian territories. By 1186, he had united Egypt, Syria, northern Mesopotamia, and much of the Jazira under his banner. For the first time since the early days of Islam, a single power controlled both the Nile and the roads to Anatolia, encircling the Crusader states on land, while the sea remained their only lifeline. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, now ruled by Baldwin IV, the young leper king, and then briefly by his nephew Baldwin V, faced this growing pressure with a divided court. After Baldwin V's early death in 1186, the throne passed to Baldwin IV's sister Sibylla and her husband Guy of Lusignan. Guy was a Poiffin noble who had arrived in the East in the 1170s, handsome, brave in single combat, but widely distrusted for his ambition and lack of political skill. Many barons preferred Raymond III of Tripoli, a seasoned regent during Baldwin IV's minority, who favoured diplomacy with Saladin and had even signed truces that kept the frontier quiet for years. Raymond owned vast estates, spoke Arabic fluently, and maintained good relations with Muslim emirs. The rivalry between Guy and Raymond split the nobility into factions. The court party around Guy and his allies, including Reynald of Chatillon, Lord of Kerak, and the nobles of the land, who backed Raymond. Tensions boiled over in 1187. Reynald of Chatillon, never one for restraint, attacked a large Muslim caravan travelling from Cairo to Damascus during a period of truce. He killed or captured most of the merchants and seized their goods. Saladin demanded restitution. Guy refused to force Reynald to comply. The attack broke the fragile peace and gave Saladin the pretext he needed. He assembled an army of perhaps 30,000 men, cavalry, infantry, and auxiliaries, and crossed the Jordan in late June 1187, heading toward Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. Raymond's wife Ashiva held Tiberias with a small garrison while Raymond himself was in Tripoli. When Saladin besieged the town, Ashiva sent urgent pleas for relief. The kingdom's army gathered at Sephoria, a well-watered plateau northwest of Tiberias. The barons met in council. Raymond argued strongly against marching. The summer heat was brutal. Water sources between Sephoria and Tiberias were scarce, and Saladin had deliberately chosen ground that favoured his mobile horsemen. Better to stay put, let Saladin exhaust his supplies attacking a fortified town, then strike when he withdrew. Most senior commanders, including Humphrey of Tauron and Balian of Ibelin, agreed. But Guy listened to the other side. Reynald and others accused Raymond of cowardice or even treason, pointing to his Muslim ties. The true cross, carried by the Bishop of Acre, was brought into the tent. Its presence was said to demand action. Guy reversed the decision and ordered the march. On July 3, the army, around 20,000 men, including 1,200 knights, several thousand infantry, and contingents from the military orders, set out across the dry plain toward Tiberias. The sun beat down without mercy. The dust rose in choking clouds. Saladin's scouts harassed them constantly, setting grass fires that filled the air with smoke and driving the Crusaders away from the few springs. By afternoon they were parched, their horses stumbling, their formations ragged. They reached the horns of Hattin, two low hills rising from the plain late in the day. Saladin had manoeuvred to cut them off from water. His main force waited on the higher ground, archers and cavalry ready. The Crusaders formed a defensive circle around the true cross, but thirst and exhaustion had already broken their cohesion. Through the night they suffered. Men drank their own urine or the blood of horses. At dawn on July 4, Saladin attacked in waves. The infantry, desperate for water, broke ranks and tried to reach Lake Tiberias several miles away. They were cut down or captured. The knights charged repeatedly, but were repulsed each time by disciplined Muslim cavalry, using feigned retreats and arrow storms. By mid-morning the Frankish army collapsed. The infantry was slaughtered or enslaved. The knights fought on foot after their mounts died. The true cross was captured, a devastating symbolic loss. Guy, Reynald, and most of the high nobility were taken alive. Saladin personally executed Reynald in his tent after the prisoner insulted him. Guy and the others were treated with honour as valuable hostages. The military orders suffered worst. Templars and Hospitallers were offered conversion or death. Nearly all chose death. Hattin destroyed the kingdom's field army in a single day. Saladin moved quickly. Tiberias fell. Then Acre surrendered without a fight. Beirut, Sidon, Jaffa followed in rapid succession. Jerusalem itself, defended by Balian of Ibelin with a handful of knights and the city militia, held out until late September. Balian negotiated surrender on terms. The inhabitants could ransom themselves and leave with what they could carry. On the 2nd of October 1187, 88 years after the First Crusade's conquest, Saladin entered the city. He allowed Christians to depart safely, for a price, restored Muslim worship at the Dome of the Rock, and showed restraint that contrasted sharply with 1,099. Many poor were released without payment at his command. The news reached Europe in waves through the winter. Chroniclers described stunned silence in courts and churches. Preachers spoke of divine punishment for sin. The loss of Jerusalem, the ultimate prize, shattered the confidence that had sustained crusading for nearly a century. Hattin and its aftermath marked the turning point. The Crusader states were reduced to a narrow coastal strip, their inland holdings gone, their military power broken. Yet the story did not end there. In the courts of England, France, and the Empire, kings began to take the cross once more. The response would be grander in scale, led by monarchs in person. But the balance had shifted permanently. The man who had achieved this stood now as the dominant power in the Levant, his legend already growing among both friend and foe. And from the west, across the same sea that had once carried conquerors, a new generation prepared to test themselves against him. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 left Europe in a state of collective shock deeper than any previous setback. Chroniclers recorded the moment as a wound to Christendom itself. Sermons in cathedrals spoke of divine anger and the urgent need for atonement. Pope Gregory VIII issued a bull calling for a new crusade even before full details arrived, but it was his successor, Clement III, who turned the appeal into action. The response came from the three most powerful rulers of the Latin West: Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II Augustus of France, and Richard I of England, known as the Lionheart. Frederick set out first in the spring of 1189, leading perhaps the largest army of the three estimates, reach 15,000 to 20,000 men. He chose the overland route through Hungary and the Balkans, the same path that had broken earlier expeditions. His march went smoothly at first. The Byzantine Emperor, Isaac II Angelos, wary after past tensions, granted passage. Frederick crossed into Asia Minor in early 1190, but near Silifke in June, while crossing the Salef River in southern Anatolia, his horse stumbled in the current. The aging emperor, weighed down by armor, was pulled under and drowned. His body was recovered, but the army fractured almost immediately. Many returned home, others scattered or were picked off by Turkish raiders. The German contingent, once the strongest, vanished before it could reach the coast. Philip II and Richard departed later, both by sea from different ports. Philip sailed from Vézelay in the summer of 1190 with a disciplined but smaller force, arriving at Acre in April 1191. Richard left England in September 1190, delayed by preparations and the need to secure his new kingdom after his father Henry II's death. His fleet stopped in Sicily, where he seized Messina from its Norman ruler, then wintered in Cyprus after conquering the island from its Byzantine usurper, Isaac Komnenos. He sold Cyprus to the Knights Templar, who later resold it to Guy of Lusignan, gaining funds and a strategic base. Richard reached Acre in June 1191. The siege of Acre had already dragged on for nearly 2 years. Saladin had besieged the city after Hattin, but the garrison held out, supplied by sea from Tyre and supported by arriving crusaders. Guy of Lusignan had encamped outside the walls with what remained of the kingdom's forces. Philip and then Richard joined them. The siege was a grinding affair, catapults pounding the walls day after day, mining tunnels, collapsing towers, disease spreading through crowded camps where the smell of unburied dead mixed with salt air and smoke. Both sides suffered heavily from scurvy and dysentery. When the city finally surrendered in July 1191, the terms allowed the garrison to ransom themselves. Saladin delayed payment, perhaps hoping to buy time. Richard, impatient and fearing the prisoners would be used as reinforcements if released, ordered the execution of around 2,700 Muslim captives in full view of Saladin's army. The act shocked contemporaries on both sides and poisoned relations. Saladin responded by killing Frankish prisoners in retaliation when he could. The massacre remains one of the darkest episodes of the Crusade. With Acre secured, the kings turned south along the coast. Philip, ill and politically pressed at home, his son was young. His barons, restless, decided to return to France in August 1191, after quarrelling with Richard over command and spoils. He left most of his troops under the Duke of Burgundy, but took his personal contingent back, leaving Richard as the dominant leader. Richard pressed on toward Jerusalem. In September 1191, his army marched south, keeping close to the sea for supplies. Saladin shadowed them inland, harassing flanks and cutting water sources. At Arsuf on September 7, the Crusaders formed a tight marching column with infantry shielding the knights. Saladin launched a major attack, hoping to break the formation. Richard held discipline until the moment was right, then led a devastating countercharge that shattered the Muslim lines. The victory at Arsuf was clear but limited. Saladin withdrew in good order, and the Crusaders suffered losses too. They reached Jaffa, securing the coastal plain, but Jerusalem lay inland across waterless hills. Twice, Richard marched toward the Holy City in late 1191 and again in the summer of 1192, but each time he halted short of the walls. Scouts reported Saladin's forces strongly entrenched, supplies were thin, winter rains turned roads to mud. Richard's own health faltered, many knights urged retreat. He understood that even if he took Jerusalem, holding it without a larger army and secure supply lines would be impossible. Negotiations began in earnest. Through intermediaries including Balian of Ibelin and Al-Adil, Saladin's brother terms emerged. In September 1192, they agreed to a 3-year truce. The Crusaders kept a narrow coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, including Acre, Ascalon, which Richard demolished to prevent its use against them, and the right of Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem safely. Saladin retained the interior, including the Holy City itself. Guy of Lusignan received Cyprus as compensation for the lost kingdom. Conrad of Montferrat, who had defended Tyre so stubbornly, was assassinated shortly before the agreement, likely by assassins, though motives remain debated. Henry of Champagne, Richard's nephew, became nominal king of the reduced realm. Richard sailed home in October 1192, captured en route by Leopold of Austria, who held a grudge from the siege of Acre, then handed to Emperor Henry VI, who ransomed him for a vast sum. He returned to England in 1194, but never came back to the east. The Third Crusade achieved no reconquest of Jerusalem, yet it preserved the coastal foothold that allowed the Crusader presence to survive another century. More enduring was the myth it created. Richard and Saladin emerged as archetypes, the chivalrous Christian warrior and the noble Muslim Sultan, each respecting the other's courage even in war. Stories spread of their exchanges of gifts, Richard sending fruit and snow to the ailing Saladin, Saladin returning a doctor when Richard fell ill. Chroniclers on both sides portrayed them as worthy adversaries, their personal rivalry overshadowing the broader conflict. The King's Crusade ended not in triumph or utter defeat, but in stalemate, sealed by mutual exhaustion. The narrow strip along the shore remained Frankish, a fragile reminder of what had been, and in the years that followed, that fragile hold would face new tests, as ambition and circumstance pulled the crusading ideal in directions no one had foreseen. The truce that followed the Third Crusade left the Crusader states clinging to a narrow coastal strip, but the idea of reclaiming Jerusalem did not fade. In 1198, a new pope ascended the throne of Street, Peter Innocent III. Young, brilliant, and fiercely determined to assert the supremacy of the papacy over both secular rulers and the Eastern Church, Innocent saw the crusade as the ultimate instrument of his authority. He preached a new expedition with renewed urgency, promising the same plenary indulgence and framing the venture as a sacred duty that would unite Christendom under Rome's leadership. His call was heard, though the response was slower and more cautious than before. Kings hesitated. The memory of the Third Crusade's costs lingered, but nobles, knights, and younger sons still answered. The Fourth Crusade took shape in 1201, 1202, under the leadership of a group of northern French barons, chief among them Boniface of Montferrat and Geoffrey of Villehardouin, who later wrote one of the principal eyewitness accounts. They chose to travel by sea, negotiating transport with Venice, the maritime republic whose fleet dominated the eastern Mediterranean. The Venetians, under the aged but formidable Doge Enrico Dandolo, agreed to provide ships for 33,500 crusaders in exchange for 85,000 silver marks, a huge sum. The crusaders gathered in Venice in the summer of 1202, but far fewer arrived than expected, perhaps 12,000 at most. They could not pay the full amount. The debt grew into a crisis. Dandolo, nearly blind but shrewd and ruthless, saw an opportunity. He proposed a solution. The Crusaders would help Venice settle an old score first. The Christian city of Zara, on the Dalmatian coast, had rebelled against Venetian rule and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. Zara was Catholic, its inhabitants fellow Christians. In November 1202, the Crusader army besieged and stormed the city. Churches were looted, houses burned, civilians killed or driven out. The act shocked many within the ranks. Some priests refused absolution to the participants. Innocent III, when he learned of it, excommunicated the entire army, though he later quietly lifted the sentence on the leaders. Zara was handed over to Venice, and the Crusaders' debt was reduced. The moral stain, however, remained. Winter passed in Zara. The Crusades' original goal, Egypt or the Holy Land, began to recede. A new possibility appeared through Byzantine politics. Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II, had escaped to the west and was living at the courts of Philip of Swabia and Boniface of Montferrat. Alexios promised the Crusaders an enormous sum, 200,000 silver marks, plus 10,000 Byzantine troops for the Holy Land, annual contributions to the Crusade, and the submission of the Greek Church to Rome, if they would help restore his father to the throne in Constantinople. The offer was tempting. It would clear the crushing Venetian debt and provide resources for the journey east. Dandolo supported the plan. Many barons saw no other realistic path forward. In spring 1203, the fleet left Zara and sailed toward the Bosporus. Constantinople in 1203 was still the richest and most splendid city in Christendom, its walls towering above the sea, its domes and palaces gleaming in the sun. The reigning emperor, Alexios III, had come to power by blinding and deposing his brother Isaac II. When the Crusader fleet anchored off Chalcedon in June, the city was unprepared for a serious siege. The Crusaders and Venetians assaulted the Golden Horn chain and the sea walls. After sharp fighting, they gained a foothold. Alexios III fled during the night. The citizens restored the blinded Isaac II and crowned his son Alexios IV as co-emperor. But the promised money proved impossible to deliver. Taxes were raised, church treasures melted down, yet only a fraction reached the Crusaders. Tensions rose inside the city. The Greek population resented the Latin presence and the religious concessions. In January 1204, a palace coup replaced Alexios IV with Alexios V Ducas, known as Mortzuflus. The new emperor refused further payments and prepared for war. The Crusaders and Venetians now faced a stark choice: leave empty-handed or take the city by force. In April 1204, they launched a second, more determined assault. Venetian ships bridged the sea walls with scaling ladders. Knights fought their way ashore. By April 12, the defences were breached. The city fell. What followed was one of the most infamous sacks in history. Churches were stripped of relics, gold, and icons. Palaces and houses were looted. Citizens were killed, raped, or enslaved. The great library of the imperial palace burned. Ancient statues were melted for coin. Even the Hagia Sophia was desecrated, altars overturned, sacred vessels stolen, a prostitute placed on the patriarch's throne in mockery. Chroniclers on both sides described the horror with disbelief. The conquerors divided the spoils in the empire. A Latin emperor was elected, Baldwin of Flanders, and a Latin patriarch installed. Venice secured key harbours and commercial privileges. Much of the Byzantine territories were parcelled out to Crusader lords, creating the patchwork Latin Empire, the Kingdom of Thessalonica, and other fiefs. The Greek aristocracy fled to successor states in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond, where resistance continued. The sack of 1204 shattered the unity of Christendom irreparably. The schism between the Latin and Greek churches, already deep, became a chasm of hatred. Greeks viewed the Latins as barbarians who had violated the holiest city of the Christian East. Westerners justified the act as punishment for Byzantine treachery and heresy. Reconciliation would take centuries and never fully heal. The Fourth Crusade had begun with a vow to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. It ended with the destruction of the greatest Christian capital in the East and the permanent weakening of the Byzantine Empire, which never truly recovered. The ideal of the Crusade had turned inward and devoured itself. In the smoke that drifted over the ruined palaces of Constantinople, the dream of a united Christendom marching under one banner lay broken. What remained was a legacy of mistrust that would echo far beyond the walls that had once guarded it. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 marked a turning point from which the crusading movement never fully recovered. What had begun as expeditions to reclaim distant holy places now carried the stain of betrayal against fellow Christians. The ideal frayed further in the decades that followed, taking forms that ranged from tragic to grotesque. One of the strangest episodes came in 1212 with what became known as the Children's Crusade. It was not a single organized event, but two separate movements, one in France and one in Germany. In the north, a shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed visions of Christ, commanding him to lead children to the Holy Land, where the sea would part as it had for Moses. Thousands, mostly adolescents and younger children, some as young as 7, gathered in Vendôme and marched south toward Marseille. They carried crosses, sang hymns, begged for food. Church authorities tried to discourage them, but local enthusiasm and the promise of miracles kept the momentum alive. In Marseille, the sea did not part. Some were sold into slavery by unscrupulous merchants. Others simply disappeared into the crowds or returned home exhausted and disillusioned. A parallel movement in Germany, led by a boy named Nicholas, reached the Alps before most turned back or died of exposure and hunger. No children reached the Levant. No military impact occurred. The story lingered as a cautionary tale of misplaced faith and the dangers of unchecked popular fervour. Closer to home, the crusade turned inward. In southern France, the Albigensian or Cathar heresy had taken root in the region of Languedoc. The Cathars rejected much of Catholic doctrine, viewing the material world as evil and the church as corrupt. Innocent III first tried preaching and debate, but when a papal legate was murdered in 1208, he declared a crusade against the heretics. Northern French knights, led by Simon de Montfort, answered the call with promises of land and indulgence. The campaign lasted from 1209 to 1229, marked by brutal sieges, Béziers in 1209, where thousands were massacred with the infamous order, "Kill them all. God will know his own," and the eventual incorporation of Languedoc into the French crown's domain. It was the first large-scale crusade waged inside Europe against other Christians, setting a precedent for using holy war to suppress dissent and expand royal power. The traditional expeditions to the east continued, but with diminishing returns. The Fifth Crusade, 1217, 1221, targeted Egypt, capturing Damietta briefly before losing it again amid floods, disease, and poor coordination. Frederick II Hohenstaufen, excommunicated by the Pope for delays, finally sailed in 1228 on what became the Sixth Crusade. Stripped of military support by papal decree, he relied on diplomacy. Through negotiations with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil, who was embroiled in his own civil war, Frederick secured a 10-year truce that returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control without a single battle. He crowned himself king in the Holy Sepulchre in 1229. The achievement was remarkable, but it earned him little praise in Europe. Many saw it as tainted by his excommunication and his friendly dealings with Muslims. The last major royal effort came from Louis IX of France, known as Saint Louis. In 1248 he led the Seventh Crusade to Egypt, landing at Damietta and marching toward Cairo. The campaign collapsed at Mansoura in 1250 when his brother Robert of Artois was killed and Louis himself captured. He was ransomed for a fortune, then spent 4 years in Acre strengthening fortifications before returning home. In 1270 he tried again the Eighth Crusade, landing in Tunis, hoping to convert its ruler and strike at Egypt from the west. Disease swept the camp. Louis died of dysentery on August 25. His son Philip III withdrew what remained of the army. The end came quietly. The remaining coastal strongholds Acre, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut held on through the 13th century, sustained by Italian merchants and occasional reinforcements. But the Mamluk sultans of Egypt, who had replaced the Ayyubids, grew steadily stronger. In 1291, the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil besieged Acre, the last major Frankish city. After a fierce defense, the walls fell on May 18. The survivors fled by sea, many drowned in overloaded ships. The remaining outposts surrendered or were abandoned soon after. By summer's end, no Crusader-held territory remained on the mainland. The long shadow stretched far beyond 1291. The Crusades had begun with promises of redemption and unity. They ended in division, disillusionment, and the slow realization that sacred violence, once unleashed, could not easily be contained or directed. The faint echoes of those early calls still lingered in sermons and chronicles. But the fervor had cooled into something more cautious, a memory of both glory and warning. And yet the word crusade itself refused to fade, carrying forward into later centuries as a powerful, sometimes dangerous metaphor. With the fall of Acre in 1291, the physical presence of the Crusader states vanished from the Levant. The last ships carried away survivors, relics, and memories, leaving behind ruined fortresses and quiet harbours that had once echoed with Latin voices. What remained was not territory, but consequences that stretched far beyond that final summer. The human cost was staggering. Estimates vary widely, but over the 2 centuries of major crusading expeditions, perhaps 1 million people, soldiers, civilians, pilgrims, camp followers lost their lives on both sides. Battles, sieges, starvation, disease, and massacres claimed lives in numbers that defy easy comprehension. Entire generations of noble families were decimated. Villages in France and Germany were left without young men. Muslim towns along the coast bore scars of repeated destruction. The schism between Western and Eastern Christianity deepened into something nearly irreparable. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 turned suspicion into open enmity. Greek chroniclers described the Latins as worse than barbarians. Western writers justified the act as necessary correction of heresy. The Orthodox Church never forgot, and the reunion attempts that followed at Lyon in 1274, at Florence in 1439, collapsed under the weight of mutual distrust. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, many Greeks preferred Turkish rule to submission to Rome. In the West, the papacy emerged stronger. The Crusades gave popes a tool to rally Christendom, impose taxes on the clergy, and assert spiritual authority over kings. Innocent III's vision of a united church under papal leadership reached its height during these centuries, even as later popes struggled to repeat the success. Trade and knowledge flowed in both directions more freely than before. Italian merchants, Venetians, Genoese, Pisans, established permanent quarters in Acre, Tyre, and Alexandria, carrying spices, silk, sugar, and cotton back to Europe. They also brought Arabic numerals, medical texts, Greek philosophy preserved in Arabic translation, and new technologies in navigation and warfare. The contact stimulated Europe's intellectual revival. Universities in Salerno, Montpellier, and Bologna drew on Eastern learning. Yet this exchange came at the price of centuries of violence. On both sides, the Crusades hardened images of the other. In Western chronicles, Muslims became stereotyped as treacherous infidels or noble adversaries worthy of chivalric respect, depending on the author. In Arabic sources, the Franks were often depicted as brutish invaders driven by greed and fanaticism. These portrayals lingered, shaping perceptions long after the battles ended. The very term crusade took on a life of its own. It became a metaphor for any righteous struggle, against heretics, against political enemies, against distant threats. Popes declared crusades against the Hohenstaufen emperors. European monarchs used the language to justify colonial expansion. In later centuries, the word was invoked for wars of religion, national liberation, even ideological campaigns. The idea of a holy war mobilized people across cultures and eras, often with little connection to the original expeditions. In the end, the Crusades were more than a series of military campaigns. They represented the first prolonged, large-scale encounter between two civilizations that had once shared a common Mediterranean world. For 200 years, Latin Christians and Muslims, along with Eastern Christians, Jews, and others caught in between, met in conquest, trade, alliance, and slaughter. The meeting was brutal, often tragic, rarely equal. Yet it was a meeting nonetheless, one that left wounds that have never fully closed, and myths that still shape how each side sees the other. Today, when the phrase crusade is used in political rhetoric, or when old divisions are invoked in new conflicts, we hear faint echoes of those distant centuries. The banners are gone, the walls have crumbled, but the stories remain quiet, reminders of what happens when faith, fear, and ambition collide on a scale that spans generations.